Okay, we're live. Greetings and good evening, friends and comrades. Daniel Tutt here with Raju Das to discuss the Marxist theory of class. And we're very honored that Professor Das, who teaches at York University, can join us tonight. He is the author of about 5 different books. The one that we are most, or that piqued my interest the most, is Marxist theory, Marxist class theory, or Marxist class theory for a skeptical world in particular. And Raju, I wanted to start off by, and of course, let me just mention that he studies Marxist theory. He studies. He has a big work right now on Capital, Volume 1. He has also written a more recent book after the Marxist class theory called Political Economy of New India, Critical Reflections on Economy and Politics in India, a Class Theory Perspective, also published by Brill. And his forthcoming book is called Marxist Capital, Capitalism and the State, with Taylor and Francis. So, Raju, I'd like to start off by asking you, what made you want to write the book on Marxist class theory?
Thank you, Daniel, for inviting me to speak once again. For the audience, those of you who have not seen the book is like this, and it looks like this, and it looks like this. And the very night when I submitted a 900-page manuscript to the publisher, I vomited. I was taken to emergency by my wife. And then I said to myself, I'm vomiting today or tonight, and I want the bourgeoisie to vomit one day. But anyway, yes, I was responding to many things. One is, of course, the idea about the death of class, that class is dead. People are not working in mines or in factories, and people don't say they belong to the working class. They say they are women or blacks, or etc. So many people have been saying that class does not matter, or it does not matter much. Within Marxism, there has been quite a bit of discussion, and I have discussed 2 main theories within Marxism of class. But I learned from these theories, but I was not convinced by what they had to say. So the inadequacies within Marxism about class, what class is, what class does, that prompted me to write about class theory. The book is not about any country. There is very little. In fact, there is almost nothing in terms of empirical content. There might be some examples from here and there. So it's an enterprise, if I can say, in pure theory. What else should I say? So yes, but there are other reasons why I wanted to write this, and the way I wrote this, maybe that will be clear in a minute. But let me stop here. So I was basically reacting to what was being said about class outside of Marxism, in academia and media, etc. And I lay out some of those ideas in the introduction. And I was also reacting, more importantly, to what was being said inside Marxism. And I was not happy with what was being said. And you will shortly perhaps hear as to why I was not happy with what I heard, or what I learned from Marxism. So I want to write a book. But this book is a part of a series of 5 or 6. And the follow-up to the book just came out a couple of weeks ago. It's on state theory. The title is Marx Capital, Capitalism and Limits to the State. And it looks like this. The publisher forced me to cut it down to 400 pages because it was going to be on 300 pages. But then there are two more on the state coming, and there is one on Capital Volume 1 itself. So this book is a part of a series of books. And in fact, the last one in the series would be on the nature of Marxist theory in defending Marxism's superiority, not only distinctive character. Marxism is not only different from non-Marxism. For me, Marxism is superior to anything else that humanity has created in the realm of thought.
So you begin the text in a way by breaking down a long kind of analysis and summary of two kind of very predominant forms of Marxist class theory. The first is anti-essentialist Marxism, and the second is what's called analytical Marxism. And I think it's worth a bit of kind of review for the benefit of viewers and listeners. Let's start, if we can, with analytical Marxism. I'd like to invite you to say a few things about it. Eric Olin Wright is one of the most important and prominent names within this orientation. And we were just talking before the show how much respect and admiration that you have for Wright as an academic, as a theorist. At the same time, I feel as if what he did with Marx, with his own theory of class, was, well, let's say, constituted quite a divergence from class theory that we see from Marx up through Marx and Engels, up through Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky, etc., which you are much more interested in centering. Can we start with a little bit of background on Eric Olin Wright and maybe say a few things about sort of what is analytical Marxism?
Right. I should begin by saying, and just to echo what you have just said, I have a huge amount of respect for Eric Olin Wright's work. I nearly have all of his works, all of his books on class in my library. But there are fundamental problems. But first of all, what is analytical Marxism? Just pardon me for my use of an impolite term. It's non-bullshit Marxism. Oh, that's how it has been represented as by some from within analytical Marxism. It's against what it calls vulgar Marxism. It uses conventional scientific procedures, including empirical methodology, to study the kinds of topics that Marxists have studied, democracy, the state, class, etc. It's very much focused on, much of analytical Marxism is very much focused on intentional explanation. What do individuals do and why? I discussed very briefly in the introduction to the chapter on analytical Marxism as about what actually it is. It has a few attributes, and some of which I just mentioned. When I discuss analytical Marxism's class theory, it will be clear to you what analytical Marxism actually is. Instead of saying in abstract terms what that kind of Marxism is, you'll know from its actual practice. When analytical Marxism applies its more sort of abstract ideas about what Marxism is, then you'll know what analytical Marxism actually is. So I can go on to explain in a few words as to what analytical Marxism's theory of class is.
Let's do that. Absolutely.
Okay. So analytical. One reason why I like analytical Marxism, of course, there are many reasons why I don't, but one reason why I like it, it is quite scientific. Meaning it believes in reasoning. You may disagree with its reasoning, and it believes in connecting reason to evidence. It believes in connecting concepts, one concept to another, and concepts to theory, etc. So so in terms of class, it begins with the idea that, look, in the world we have different kinds of assets or wealth. Let's call them assets. So you have factories and land, etc., or capital, and you have you have labor power, our ability to work. That's also an asset. You have what Eric Wright calls organizational asset, meaning what a manager does, the ability to make decisions in a factory or in an enterprise or a call center. And then the kinds of skills that professors or doctors and engineers, the highly skilled people, experts possess. So these are these three attributes, but three assets. These three assets are unequally distributed. So under feudalism, let's say people had control over their labor power, or some people had, other people didn't, but most people didn't. So landlords had control over effectively the ability to work of the peasantry. So you had landlords and peasants. Under capitalism, a very interesting thing happens. There are three kinds of assets that are unequally distributed. We all have control over our ability to work, but most of us don't have the three assets that Eric Wright talks about. One is capital, including in its physical form, machines and factories and etc. Then, as I said, organizational asset. We are not managers. We don't have the ability to control other people's work or hire them, fire them, etc. And then expert knowledge. Now, these assets are unequally distributed. So you have capitalists and workers with respect to the first unequal distribution of the first asset. Then you have managers and ordinary workers. Then you have experts and non-experts. So there are three unequal distributions of assets. So in other words, within capitalism, there is not only capital-labor relation, and there are also other things. Now, from these ideas, very simple ideas, interesting conclusions follow. So if you fight capitalism, Eric Wright says, it's not necessary that socialism will come. Why not? And say, well, then there will be inequality between managers and the rest. Then there will be inequality between experts and non-experts. So it's not enough to nationalize capitalist private property. In fact, it's not just that it's not enough. He's dubious about even the project of a revolution against capitalist private property, which I'll come to in a minute. So socialism is not the only future of capitalism. That's the fundamental conclusion. Why? Because after you nationalize private property, capitalist private property, you will have another society where the managers will be more powerful. Then after you have democratized the running of the enterprises, etc., so managers are gone, then you will have the inequality between experts and non-experts. So that's another kind of society. So a series of or multiple post-capitalist societies will come after capitalism. But you see how it is different from Marxism. For Marxism, you overthrow capitalism, capitalist private property, then you will have socialism or beginning of a social society. But there are many other things. The chapter on analytical Marxism is very long. Then the critique, etc., etc. I'll just mention a couple of things. For Eric Wright, and again, I want to go back to his analytical Marxism itself. He, towards the later part of his life, maybe the last 20 years or so, he wanted to build a Marxism that's much thinner, not as ambitious as Marxism has been.
Mm.
He wanted a thinner Marxism, therefore a thinner class theory. What's a thinner class theory? Well, the analytical power, the causal power of class has to be clipped, has to be reduced. Don't say class can't do this, class can't do that. So the primacy of class is denied.
Mm.
This is common with post-modernist Marxism.
Right. Or
For me,
anti-essentialist. Yeah.
yes. For me, it's not important to say that society is class divided. I have to then go to the next step, which is class has primacy over everything
Mhm.
else.
Mhm.
These people will not agree.
Do they not agree because of a mutation or a change within capitalism, or do they not agree because that's their reading of Marx?
Postmodernist Marxism does not agree. That's their philosophical protocol. Nothing is X is not more important than Y, Z, K, L, N. You just cannot say that. I always say to them jokingly in my university and elsewhere, well, if X is not more important than Y, why should you and I be talking now? The weather is outside. The weather outside is very nice. Let's go take a walk. If eating is not more important than not eating, then why eat?
You make a nice point about that, which is that because they don't posit a constitutive antagonism, because class doesn't have an ontological philosophical conception at the core, which you have multiple chapters showing that Marxism does posit an ontological conception of the primacy of class without question, and that the antagonism, therefore, amongst the classes is one that necessitates the abolition of the class system as such, whereas with both anti-essentialist Marxism as well as analytical Marxism, they have decided that the abolition of classes is not possible. Or is it, would you say that it's not possible, or that it is not wise, it's not strategic? What makes this, because ultimately it's a kind of Marxism that's an anti-revolutionary Marxism.
Yes. Eric Wright is an egalitarian. Make no mistake about it. He would be close to something like this DSA type. In fact, one of his former students, Bibek Chiber, as many people know, is closely associated with the DSA. And I wanted to find out what's the connection. And then I came to know that, yes, there is a connection. Eric Wright talks about democratic socialism, etc. Let's just talk very briefly about his politics. So he says there are three kinds of ways in which you can change capitalism. One is revolutionary. He says that's a no. Revolutionary, or what he calls ruptural strategy, a complete break with the system. That's a no. It may have some relevance in poor countries, but definitely not America. Not America. Well, if that won't work, then what will work? Because remember, he's an egalitarian. He's not a conservative person. He's very egalitarian and very smart, of course. So there are two other strategies. There are technical names for those strategies, but basically what that means is government intervention. The government will do something for us, and from below action. So worker cooperatives, for example, social economy, etc. Again, personally, I'm not opposed to any of those things, by the way. So basically, that's how. So revolutionary strategy is out, off the table, because that won't work. I remember why that won't work. One reason why that won't work is once you overthrow capitalism, he's not convinced that socialism will come because the next society will be one that is first dominated by managers and secondly experts. So in other words, basically what he's saying is Stalinism is actually inherent to the fight against capitalism. That's the sort of implicit conclusion. A Stalinist society is inevitable. Anyway, so people should just do incremental changes, engage in incremental changes, and someday those incremental changes will be so powerful that society will change to something much bigger. Then he says, when those incremental changes have become so massive, so powerful, that maybe revolutionary rupture might work, but he's dubious. But then he says, what if there will be limits to incremental changes? He's not, I know he's very smart. He knows that there will be limits. The capitalist class is not going to sit tight or sit idly when people are building worker cooperatives, etc., etc. He says, what will happen? He says, I don't know. This is exactly what he says. I don't know. So I'm not even sure that incremental changes will work, but he's skeptical of revolution. So basically, his conclusion is effectively, I don't know how to change capitalism into socialism. That's the conclusion. I want to add just a couple of things in terms of concepts. Capital and labor. He differentiates assets in terms of capital or machines, factories, etc. Then that's different from the power of managers to hire and fire. How is this different? A capitalist is a capitalist because you own factories, you control factories, etc. So this sort of conceptualization of private property along these three lines. So physical capital, then managerial abilities and power, and expert knowledge. I don't know. In fact, no, I know that that's wrong. I've spent a lot of time critiquing that sort of stuff. But one more thing. If doctors and professors get paid more than ordinary workers sitting in Detroit or in New York City, is that because doctors and professors are actually exploiting manual laborers or poor people? No. In fact, it's so funny that he actually once questions himself. But his main theory says that expert knowledge is a basis for exploitation. So basically, middle class people they exploit ordinary working class people. So if you read between the lines, I have spent a lot of time reading through his work. It is extremely inadequate, very inadequate. Then for Marxism, the proletariat, the working class is central to any project of socialist revolution. For him, no, there is nothing unique about the working class, etc. And I can go on, but so these are some of the things. Oh no! So maybe one more. So you see, exploitation happens because of unequal distribution of assets in a market economy. Therefore, to explain how exploitation happens, you don't have to look at the production process or the labor process. That is Eric Wright. Lo and behold, that is also the view of Vivek Chibar, who is associated with the DSA. How can that be? How can we explain capitalist exploitation in a class society, unless we understand what happens inside what Marx calls the hidden abode of production? But for analytical Marxism, to understand exploitation, we don't have to explain or understand the nature of production itself.
Yeah, because they ultimately maintain the view, as do the anti-essentialist Marxists, that the status of the surplus that capitalism produces is in fact an inevitability which cannot be overcome. Therefore, socialist politics really should be centered on a better, more equitable form of distribution of the surplus. So if the surplus is an inevitability, you say capitalism is an inevitability. So your Marxism has become fundamentally compromised. You could say reformist, to use an old antiquated term, although you raised the DSA, and I wanted to ask you your kind of, let's say, comradely critique of DSA. Would you mind sharing your views? Because you've mentioned it twice now.
In these times when fascistic tendencies are knocking on our door, when we all could be, that is, humanity in its entirety could be roasted to death, we have to be very careful about saying or doing anything that further divides the broader left. I want to begin by saying that. But at the same time, as Lenin would say, differentiation and shades of differentiation and serious differences of opinion must be out in the open. DSA is, for me, it's far too close to the Democratic Party, a bourgeois party, an imperialist party, than I would ever think should be done. Again, I mentioned Eric Wright, Vivek Chibber, etc., in relation to the DSA. There are conceptual problems with this sort of thinking DSA is non-revolutionary Marxism, to the extent that there is any Marxism for me, and therefore any sort of non-revolutionary Marxism is not good Marxism for me. Let me say, this is not about DSA, so I don't want to say too many things about DSA.
Sure.
But I should say that if anything, even any small thing in terms of organizing people, etc., is a good thing, but there are matters of principles in terms of so.
Yes. So class is not rendered primary, although if you take someone like Chibber, his recent book, which I've looked at, I haven't finished, is framed, and he spends a lot of time dissecting the error of the so-called cultural turn within the left and within academia. And you have also criticized the cultural turn. I was wondering if you might say a couple of things about how you perceive the sort of impasses or the deadlocks that have come with the cultural turn, because in a way we're at a moment now where perhaps there's an opportunity to burst through some of those deadlocks that have weighed at least intellectual Marxist thinking down for a few generations, maybe. So what would you say about this? About the cultural turn. We've talked about Eric Olin Wright, but maybe could we switch and discuss this?
I congratulate Vivek Chibber on his book, which is a couple of years ago, which is a critique of the kind of thinking that subaltern studies represented from the less developed world, from South Asia, actually. But the so Vivek Chibber insists on the objective, the material reality of capitalism, and his right to do so. The cultural turn is not so geographically narrow, though. It is a global process. There is culturalization of economy and politics everywhere. So everything is seen in terms of culture. If you don't talk about culture, it's as if you cannot talk about economy and you cannot talk about politics. The cultural turn, philosophically speaking, is modern day idealism, which is to say that for the cultural turn people, the society has to be analyzed in terms of the ideas about society that are in the minds of individuals. For me, the approach should be the opposite, or the dialectical opposite. By that, I mean the following. Society must be explained in terms of objective processes that transcend individual lives and thinking. But at the same time, what individuals think or groups of people think and do, that also has some influence on the objective processes.
Mm-hmm.
The cultural turn would not agree. It's the primacy of the discursive thinking or thought,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes individual level action, etc. That has been given far too much importance, and that is manifested somehow in in class theory, but not quite. The connection between the cultural, or what you are calling cultural turn here, and class theory is slightly different. We'll get to that. But the cultural turn, in fact, I have been saying in my work on the far right, cultural turn, the postmodern term, let's call it the postmodern turn. I'm actually also writing about the post-truth politics in America and in India, these two democracies. And next year I'll have a book on lying and love, or lying and loving. Anyway, that's a separate story. The cultural turn, the postmodern term, which negates the importance of facts and factuality and objective processes and truth, etc., is very much allied with, despite their intention, very much allied with the fascistic tendencies of Trump and the right-wing people in India, etc., etc. So that is dangerous. So anyway, so there are lots of things about the cultural turn one can talk about. The main thing is their idealism in terms of the philosophy of the world. And Marx actually mocked at the culturalists or idealists of his time by asking a question: if you drown yourself in water, do you drown yourself in water because of the idea of gravity or the objective process of gravity? If I lose my jobs because of the economic crisis in New York City, or the banking crisis in New York City, am I losing the job because of the idea of the crisis or because of the crisis itself? This has to be answered. The cultural turn people will answer, of course, in a specific way, which is just wrong.
Okay. Right. And the other point is the influence of postmodern theory, cultural turn, as well as these other watered down Marxism, is that we end up thinking that class is a kind of voluntarist category or a kind of mental construct, and we lose track from the primacy. And then, of course, the primacy of class from Marx's viewpoint is ultimately around the antagonism between two primary classes, bourgeoisie, proletariat. And you show that even David Harvey, the great interpreter of Marx's Capital, has abandoned that thesis from Marxism for different reasons than the analytical or the anti-essentialists, okay? But nonetheless, they abandon it. Can you make a case for why it should not be abandoned as Marxists? Why should we not abandon this kind of, why were Marx and Engels correct that the contestation of the capitalist system produces ultimately an antagonism between two primary classes? Why is that correct?
Capitalist society is based on the fact that the capitalist class owns and controls the means of production. It appropriates surplus value from the working class. It benefits at the expense of the working class. It controls the working class in the sphere of production. And it denies the things that the working class needs to live an adequate life. This is not because capitalist class people are bad people.
Mm-hmm.
They have to do this.
Mm.
So the capitalist class does to the working class what it does, not because capitalist class people are bad people.
Mm.
And this is why, by the way, I do not accept physical violence against the capitalist class, unless there are drastic circumstances. Because remember, this, I mean, there is something to be said for class hatred. So that's, I'm actually writing a book on love and lying, etc., etc. But the capitalist class people are not necessarily bad people. Marx used the word cog in the wheel. They are doing what they must do. The working class people are not able to meet their needs because of the capitalist class, and hence the fundamental contradiction. It's not just difference. Remember, I talk about this in the chapters on class consciousness and class struggle. Class consciousness happens when I think that not only that my wages are low, but when I think that my interests are fundamentally incompatible with the capitalist class interests, and therefore capitalism must go, because unless until capitalism goes, my interests will not be met. That is the height of, that is class consciousness. So you can see there are objective reasons why there are these antagonistic interests, and
Mm-hmm.
that's where Marx also said that the proletarian will be compelled to fight against the capitalist class, whether it wants to or not.
Mm.
And many times I have been in the reviews that have appeared on the class, people have written now very long essays on the book. So one writer from England says, Raju, why are you using the word sheep for the working class? I said, Marx has used it. Marx actually has used such words as sheep
Hmm.
and things like that. Because remember, I think people have a fundamental misunderstanding of Marxist theory of the proletariat class.
Hmm.
The abstract, the general abstract concept of the working class is one, but what the working class how the working class behaves in a specific place and at a specific time, that's very different. I have seen working class people voting for, let's say, the right wing party in India, for example, or the
Hmm.
right wing parties here.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean that they are not working class people, etc., etc. Anyway, so in answering a question, there are objective reasons by virtue of class relationships why the proletarian class and the capitalist class, they have antagonistic relationship. And
Hmm.
as long as there is capitalism, this antagonism cannot be removed. Hence, capitalism must go. But the only way capitalism will go is not because it goes through crisis, etc. No, 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 no. There is no automatic collapse of capitalism. The only way it will go, in fact, I have after the book was published, I have an algebra for revolution, a sort of little equation. While reading Marx, one of biographies on capital, Love and Capital, I think, I was reading that in Switzerland. I had this idea about under what conditions revolution will come. Anyway, so the point is, when there is economic crisis and there is class struggle, and there are other conditions, then only capitalism will be overthrown. And overthrowing capitalism is the only way to getting rid of capitalism. The incremental changes, or in anti-essential Marxism, struggle over redistribution of the surplus. Yeah, do all those things. I'm not opposed to reforms at all.
Hmm.
But advocating reforms is not the same as being a reformist. They're very
Hmm.
different. Very
Hmm.
different.
Hmm.
So the only way to get rid of capitalism is by overthrowing it.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the branch that you see in social science and sociology that has popped up since the 90s called working class studies, where the basic overture of this field of research revolves around trying to understand the kind of emotional life of the suppressed post-industrial working class and trying to understand, things like the opioid overdose, or trying to understand things like working class resentment. And I've read a fair amount of these essays in these books. Part of it is, in my view, a strange kind of response to the working class undergoing kind of reverse identity politics, where because the culture is so hegemonically, ideologically liberalized, it has a liberalist way of thinking about social change. And because the anti-essentialist Marxist view is so triumphant, everyone is forced to think that their condition, if they are working class, is ultimately a kind of contingent mental choice, in a sense. So there is a kind of, what I would call a kind of ubiquitous or a pervasive idealism that prevents the working class from seeing itself as an emancipatory agent. If that's true, and you may disagree with what I just said, seems to me the question then would be some kind of, what is the education involved with correcting this issue? So let me ask you those two questions. One is sort of, what do you think about working class studies more generally in sociology departments? And a lot of it's ethnographical in a sense, right? Trying to go in and study the everyday life of working class people. What is your reading of that? And two, what do you see as sort of the most essential kind of educative interventions here for working class consciousness?
In terms of my thinking, my focus is sort of 50-50 or 60-40 on economics and politics. I'm weak on the cultural side, generally. I have neglected the cultural dimension of the working class so far, which will be rectified soon in the form of a book on working class culture. My friend from England, Jamie Goff, and I, we are writing a book on working class culture in terms of self-help and reciprocity and all those nice things that happen in the everyday life of working class.
Mm-hmm.
I actually spent 3 years of my life when I was in the UK after my PhD in Ohio at Ohio State, Columbus, Ohio. I moved to the UK to teach, and that's when I had a grant to study working class culture, actually. But I've kind of neglected it, relatively speaking. It is very important, and I do not know enough. So I want to rectify that error in my thinking. I actually talk about working class studies in one of the chapters, and I critique them.
Yeah.
Working class studies as a field has come in sociology, history, in geography. It is called labor geography.
Mm-hmm.
And among many of my criticisms of that strand of thinking about the working class is its voluntarism.
Yep.
The working class thinks this, does that, etc., etc. Look, I'm not somebody who is going to say ideas do not matter. No. But ideas matter only within a field that is limited by objective conditions. So this dialectical approach to ideas is really missing. That's far too much importance. For example, in labor geography, which is the counterpart, which is part of working class studies, it says, the trade union, the labor unions, they can make use of scale and geography, etc., to fight for working class rights. For example, instead of when the government is or the capitalists, they split the working class organizing along geographical lines. The labor unions should fight for, instead of local contracts, national contracts. Yes,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
we can be opposed to that. But anyway, overall, there is far too much important emphasis that's given to voluntary activity and voluntary thinking than I can accept. So there's a lot more about this, and I don't want to go into the details. In terms of educative value, what exactly do you mean? By the way, I'm actually there's a group of people in England that have asked me to write a piece on class struggle in academia and in education, actually. So
Uh-huh.
I'm trying to think about the how working class can be educated,
Yeah.
um, uh, including the areas such as academia, which is not this sort of very conducive place for working class education.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think, practical things, small steps can be taken, and we can talk about that. That here in Toronto, for example, some friends, a group of us, we are trying to build a school for socialism, for example. It hasn't
Mm-hmm.
quite happened. Then we have set up a series of informal reading groups over time. I mean, my students and I, we have set up, we have done reading groups over the last 10, 15 years. Lots of things can be done. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that these all these initiatives must include ordinary working class people. That hasn't quite happened. That doesn't mean it cannot happen. But I don't know what else I can say
No,
about.
that's good. No, that's very helpful. I was just curious because I saw you critique the working class studies field, and I was drawn to it. I was interested in it. I was wanting to see maybe what your thought is regarding the kind of symptom that it may represent. And my contention is that part of the symptom that it represents in a paradoxical way is that there's no scenario that I could envision in which the academic world would ever be willing to grant in some kind of making like a 180 of thinking about the working class in the same way that Marx and Engels did. So it seems to me like a difficult question because we seem quite far away from that prospect, perhaps, unfortunately. And maybe then furthermore, obviously, this question of education is going to happen through the labor struggles, through socialist culture making, institution building, working class culture development, and so on and so forth, and hopefully a working class party formation in time. That would be okay. But let's go back to the theory after that detour. So, all right, anti-essentialist Marxism. Let's talk a little bit more about that if we could. I was struck by it in a way because we've had this debate recently, and you kick it off towards the beginning of your book, where we have a field of Marxisms, plural, is many isms, and some tend to view the almost infinite number, not literally infinite, I mean, it's finite, but there's many. Some people view that heterogeneity, that diversity of thought and theory. I'm talking here about theoretical schools of Althusserian Marxism, post-structuralist Marxism, I don't know, you could call Lacanian psychoanalytic Marxism, analytical Marxism, etc., etc., Marxist Leninist, like all of these. My question is, do you find this blossoming? What do you see as positive and what do you see as negative in this kind of proliferation of many Marxisms? Let me just stop on that point and see. I want to get your thoughts on it.
Let 1,000 flowers bloom, or 100 flowers, or 5,000 flowers bloom. Did Mao not say something like this? But anyway, it doesn't matter. Look, there is something to be said for a broad socialist culture. If there are many ways of looking at society from a Marxist angle, then why not? In fact, there is a long footnote in the introduction to the book where I list, I don't know how many Marxisms, 20, 25 Marxisms, including spatial Marxism or geographical Marxism. I want to go back to David Harvey because that's what he has advocated. So from one angle, why not? I'm actually connected to a large number of Marxists in the world, and one of my closest friends in New York City always keeps saying to me, Raju, let there be many Marxisms. This is Marxism, that is Marxism, that is Marxism. Therefore, they're all Marxisms. My response is, if this claim is Marxist, that claim is Marxist, that claim is Marxist, but what is common to all these things? What is it? There has to be a Marxist. Okay, no. The idea is let there be many forms of Marxism. It's okay. I'm not entirely disagreeing, but my question is, for this goes back to Marx's distinction from between form and content. For there to be different forms of Marxism, there has to be Marxism itself. For there to be an earthen pot, there has to be clay. The clay is expressed in the form of pots and bangles and I don't know, whatever else. So there has to be a common denominator, something called Marxism, then specific kinds of Marxism. So what is it?
What is it?
So I have written quite a bit, and in fact, an entire book is coming on this, on what is really Marxism or Marxist theory. Very briefly. Now, let me start with names. Not that names matter. For many people, Marxism is Marx, or maybe Marx and Engels. I don't like that. Marx is my favorite. There isn't anyone, living or dead, whom I love more than I love Karl Marx. Yet, I would never equate Marxism to Marx. In fact, he himself would not do that. For me, Marxism is the ideas of Marx and Engels,
Mm-hmm.
and Lenin, the biggest ever Marxist of the 20th century after Marx's death, or perhaps I will say the biggest Marxist after Marx, and Lenin's legacy and Luxemburg. So I call my Marxism Melt Marxism, MELLT. M for Marx, E for Engels, L for Lenin, L for Luxemburg, and T for Trotsky. Again, these are names. What I really mean is the ideas that these people have created, and then other people who have then gone back to these ideas and made innovations and critiqued and developed those ideas, etc., etc. So that's how I define my Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't define Marxism itself. So what is Marxism? Marxism says that fundamental problems of humanity are or exist because of class relations. It says that capitalism is the modern form of class society. That capitalism is the fundamental cause of society's problems for a variety of reasons, which we won't go into. And therefore, capitalism must go for the fundamental problems of humanity to be resolved. And capitalism can only go when a massive economic and governmental crisis is combined by a massive democratically organized class struggle of men and women of different races and nationalities from below across countries. And when the working class, the masses, men and women of different nationalities and races, they capture state power, and when they begin to construct socialism, a socialist society, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
It is not, and in fact, one important intellectual and political reason or rationale for the book is as follows. It is not enough for a Marxist to say that society is class divided, there is poverty, inequality, there are class contradictions, etc. That's not, many people do that. Anthony Giddens used to do that before he became Tony Blair's guru, or maybe even after. So that's the next step is from class contradiction and class struggle. The next step is the masses of the world, the working classes of the world. By that I mean the workers, wage workers of different nationalities and races, etc., and petty small-scale producers. They must conquer state power, and they must acquire political hegemony, meaning they must be in control of the state. A term has been used for this situation. I don't quite like it, but Marx and Lenin liked it. It's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's not really a bad term if you think about this, because we live under dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So if dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is okay, you call it democracy. So why not the dictatorship of the working class? If you don't like the word dictatorship of the working class, call it political hegemony of the working class, of the working class. That's okay. But the point is, because the working class suffers due to capitalism, because capitalism is the main reason for working class suffering, and the suffering is social and ecological, by the way, and of course, constant war, etc., etc. And in wars, who are the people who really die? Not Biden's children or relatives, not the owners of or the CEOs of Toyota or Google. Ordinary people, men and women. When I was the grad program director here at York University in one of the departments, a student came from the US. He came from a modest background, and he took a leave of absence from my department to go to Afghanistan, and then he died. That has left a scar in my head. So many poor capitalism causes poverty that pushes people to the military, because they say, hey, come, fight. Then you go and die. We'll pay for your school tuition or whatever. Anyway, so the point is, Marxism not means class is primacy. The capitalism is a form of class relations. Humanity's problems are because of capitalism. Capitalism must go, but capitalism will not go unless there is class struggle. Class struggle will not happen unless there is an economic and governmental crisis. But mere class struggle is not enough. Class struggle happens, as I go on to talk about class struggle in the last couple of chapters. Class struggle is both economic, trade union form, and class struggle proper. And class struggle proper must result in the dictatorship of the proletariat. Or if you don't like the term, just call it political power of the working class, which is in control of the state. You don't have to use as I said, Marx and Lenin, they use that word. I'm not a big fan of that word because it just doesn't sound good. Point is, there must be democracy. Okay, I wrote a piece before the pandemic. What's the conception of a good society? Look, in one word, democracy in every sphere of human life. In family, in the city, in the villages, in the neighborhoods, in the country, across countries, solidarity and love among the people who belong to working class, small-scale producers, etc. That's what a post-capitalist, a socialist society should look like, and that will not happen unless capitalism goes. I'm not saying just because capitalist property is overthrown, private property is overthrown, you will have a socialist society. No. But that's a separate question. But the point is, these are necessary ingredients of Marxism: class, antagonisms, objective relations, class consciousness, class struggle, but finally, dictatorship of the proletariat. In fact, I actually end the book, I think, with a quote from Lenin. Those who recognize this is what Lenin said. Those who recognize only the class struggle are not yet Marxists. They may be found to be still within the bounds of bourgeois thinking and bourgeois politics. Remember, trade union politics is a type of bourgeois politics. They may be found to be still within the bounds of bourgeois thinking and bourgeois politics. Only he is a Marxist, just pardon Lenin's sexist language, only he is a Marxist who extends the recognition of the class struggle to the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is the touchstone on which the real understanding and recognition of Marxism should be tested. This is what Marxism is about. Going back to DSA, would they agree? Would they agree with the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat? Going back to the rationale for the class theory book, Okay, so let me say this. This is the question that I asked myself before I really, began writing the book. The book began as just one chapter and it became 12 chapters. Anyway, if the dictatorship of the proletariat is something that world must have, what kind of theory, class theory, is presupposed by that, and what kind of class theory would support that idea? The entire book, The Rationale, could be explained in just one line. If the dictatorship of the proletariat is a good idea, is to be defended, and it is to be defended, there isn't another way, then what kind of class theory is presupposed? What kind of class theory can justify that political project? This entire book revolves around this question. I have been asked by my critics, hey, why did you, even my grad students, why did you have to deal with analytical Marxism, this post-Marxism, post-modernist Marxism before you get to your own theory? I said, I had to clear some ground. But I wanted to show that the kind of Marxism that there is, including inside most of DSA perhaps, that is not Marxism and Lenin's Marxism in many, many ways. I wanted to show to the world, to Marxist scholars, that there is a Marxism, there is a genuine, a fundamentally different kind of Marxism that the academia or the media people, they are not familiar with, or if they are, they want to ignore it deliberately. And I wanted to put that Marxism on the table. But I just want to, you asked me about David Harvey. I have actually an entire book around David Harvey and Karl Marx on contract with Routledge London. David Harvey is, okay, very briefly in 2 minutes, David Harvey is known for two main ideas. One is the idea about uneven development theory, and another is idea about dispossession or accumulation by dispossession. I have written separate, very long articles on each of these theories, and for me, he is fundamentally mistaken. I will not go into the details about why he's fundamentally mistaken in terms of his Marxism. There is plenty in the class theory book, at least with respect to his dispossession, his idea of what is capitalism. For David Harvey, capitalism is mainly the dominant form of capitalism is dispossession. And then if your bank fees increase, that's dispossession. If small producers, they lose their land, that's dispossession. It's a shopping bag. I don't know. I am really, really surprised that so many people have fallen for this useless idea. I'm sorry, it's a useless idea. Anyway, but I just want to say two things about David Harvey. Recently he said, capitalism is too big to fail. We should prop up capitalism. We should not have a revolution against capitalism, because if we do, if capitalism is overthrown, we will starve. No. We are starving because we are not overthrowing capitalism. He gets it wrong. He says capital is too big to fail. We should not overthrow capitalism. My conclusion in the Marxist Class Theory book is directly opposite to Harvey's idea. But one more thing. He says, just like, in fact, in the class theory book, I show how close David Harvey is to postmodernist Marxism and analytical Marxism. Although David Harvey thinks he has his own type of Marxism, not at all. So just one line here. He says, the working class has multiple positionalities within which human beings operate. There are multiple positionalities. He says, the laborer as a person is a worker, consumer, saver, lover, bearer of culture, etc. So, in fact, he would go on to say that there is nothing unique about the proletariat as an agent of change. This is exactly what Eric Wright has said, analytical Marxism has said, postmodernist Marxism has said. So there are all these, more or less, you see that underlying all these different forms of Marxism blossoming, especially in academia, there is a fundamental common principle running away from the idea of class struggle that leads to a revolutionary overthrow of global capitalism and imperialism. And theoretically, the world of Marxism, all of these Marxisms, their intellectual history is an intellectual history of running away from the Lenin legacy, the revolutionary Marxism legacy of the 20th century, the legacy of 1917. I refer to 1917 many times throughout the book, and the reason is all these Marxisms, they want to negate the significance of 1917, and I don't have time to go into the details, but I just wanted to give an idea about what is common to these different Marxisms that are on table, and why there is a very different kind of a genuine Marxist tradition that has to be researched, critiqued, developed, and shared. In fact, I wrote an article recently on an urgent call for the development of classical Marxism or some such thing in critical. It's online. People can take a look at it.
I really liked your defense of the still relevant philosophical orientation of what we call dialectical materialism. And this is another category in Marxist thought which people have put under scrutiny. They've tried to say we somehow must move beyond dialectical materialism as a mode of analyzing social and material phenomenon. Whereas you kind of take a step back and say, okay, well, what exactly is it referring to? And you give, I think, 4 kind of crucial elements of dialectical materialism as if you like, the cornerstone of Marxist philosophy. You don't have to rehearse all 4 or anything like that, but I just wonder if you have any thoughts regarding why, or sort of, let's put it this way. What would you say to a kind of well-meaning Marxist thinker, person today, when they're faced with this question of, okay, people tell me that dialectical materialism died. It's no longer, you sound like an old dinosaur when you use the term. What would you say to them,
In grad school, I spent the first year of my PhD at Ohio State University, Columbus, doing mathematics and statistics, calculus, statistics, etc. I love empirical science, and my daughter is doing PhD in chemistry in Illinois, and so on. And my son is into economics and mathematics, and my wife comes from biology and chemistry, etc. So scientific temper is very important to my private life, personal life, and that's something I would defend all the time. Marxism is a scientific enterprise. I would like to see, in fact, to say something scientific is to say, as Alan Sokal, the physicist from New York, who rightly went after postmodernism, said that the scientific worldview is based on reason and evidence, whether it's about nature or society. I would like to really contribute to, and all of us should really contribute to a science of society. Of course, there is a difference between physical atoms and human beings and so on. So reason and evidence. But science cannot happen without philosophy. Now, my philosophy comes here partly because of my background. I still love maths, etc. 2 philosophies, actually. One is called critical realism, and one is called dialectics. In terms of dialectics, I have been heavily influenced by a friend of mine who is actually, in many ways, is an intellectual mentor, Bertel Ollman from New York. Bertel spent 6 hours one day in my home here in the Toronto area, convincing me about his view of dialectics. I was only half convinced. So I did some research on. I stand by dialectical principles, but dialectical this is a difference with Bertel. Bertel does not always and explicitly emphasize the materialist aspect of dialectics. Dialectics without materialism isn't interesting to me. Materialism without dialectics is not interesting to me either. And that's why in the chapter on the philosophy of class theory, I talk about also the difference between objectivism and materialism, going back to Lenin, etc. Okay, let me step back a little because I'm saying too many things too quickly. After I critiqued and cleared the critique all these existing Marxist ideas, and before I wanted to present my own ideas about class theory, I thought clearing some philosophical grounds that's important. So hence there is a long chapter on philosophy of class theory or philosophical ideas behind class theory. So basically, it's a defense of materialist dialectics. Okay, let me say, I said this to my graduate students. So I offer a course on for MA, MSc, and PhD students on Marxist theory. And very first class, we deal with dialectics and Marxist philosophy. I say four things. If you forget about anything, in fact, I actually have created some kind of a discursive algorithm on one page. And so I ask my students, make sure that after you have finished a chapter or an article, make sure you have tick, tick, tick all these 13 boxes. What does it mean to think dialectically? At least four things. You have to be material. No, your philosophy has to be materialistic. What does it mean? It means you have to give emphasis to the primacy, to the materiality of human life. Engels gave this famous speech at the graveyard of Marx. Of course, Engels lied that so many people came or something. I don't know. Not many. No, people perhaps came. He said, you have to eat and drink and have shelter, etc., before you can do art, science, politics, religion. That's, this is not rocket science. But these material conditions do not fall from the tree or from the moon. They have to be produced. And they have to be produced under relationships, social relations. And these social relations are objective. They transcend individual thought and action. So that's materiality. The second thing is, of course, relationality. Or the sort of sociality or relationality, meaning you cannot understand this cup without understanding its relations to many other things. And that's an interesting idea, but one has to be careful. Not all the processes that influence this cup are equally important. And here is another difference, a slight comradely difference with Bertel-Ollman, which is Bertel does not emphasize the primacy part of dialectics. For me, certain things in life are much more important than other things. Anti-essentialist Marxism rejects this sort of idea. Bertel does not emphasize this enough. And I wanted to do that. Then the third thing is totality. We have to, if we, we increasingly see that graduate students study how a cup is made, or the Canada-US border, some such parts of the system. That's interesting, but it's only partly interesting, because we should study the part of the system, let's say the making of these cups or cups like this, in such a way that our study of the cup making must say something to us about the capitalist system as a whole, of which cup making is a part. So therefore, there is something called totality, the system as a whole. Lukács was one of the people who has emphasized this. Bertel emphasizes the totality aspect of our thinking. So we have to always keep in mind that there is a totality. There may be many totalities. In some sense, the university is a totality, and we cannot understand the different departments, different academic units, apart from that totality, etc. The final thing is change through contradiction. the system, the totality, the parts of the totality are changing, and change happens through contradictions. And the change is of two types. One is gradualist or incremental change, one is change by the leap or the revolutionary change. So, for me to summarize the dialectic, materialist dialectics, or the philosophy of the Marxism that I defend, there are four things: the materiality of life, the sociality or the relationality of life, and then the totality, and then the idea that society is changing all the time. Bertrand Allman says sometimes change is happening, but we don't know that it is happening. And we have to examine why change appears not to be happening. I mean, did anyone really predict that the Arab Spring will happen, or the current crisis, in Sri Lanka, where the working class people, students, and petty small scale producers got so angry that they even forced the president to flee? Who had predicted this? So sometimes we make the mistake of not seeing the change when the change is happening.
Mm-hmm.
But change is important. But the change is driven by contradictions, contradictions in the system, in the parts, etc. So my idea was once, okay, this may be controversial, I don't know. If any open-minded, honest scholar begins with these four ideas, I'm almost certain that that scholar will knock on the door of Marxist class theory.
Mm-hmm. I want to shift gears to discuss two things that struck me in reading towards the end of your book. The first is the interesting conversation that Lenin helps us with thinking, the relationship between petty bourgeoisie and proletariat within the class struggle. And I raise this in part because if you examine a lot of recent uprisings, take Black Lives Matter, for example, even though Black Lives Matter was not necessarily kind of working with a kind of Marxist framework, did you probably observed the way that the uprising stoked the resentments of petty bourgeois classes, and we've seen the recurrence of a kind of pre-fascistic, or let's say an irrationalist tendency amongst petty bourgeoisie. And petty bourgeoisie, to be more precise, are like that kind of class which is on the kind of chasm between bourgeoisie capitalist class and proletarian. They tend to be downwardly mobile. They have a kind of they are what Eric Olin Wright would call a kind of contradictory class. Yeah. And Lenin had a kind of optimistic view of how they can be engaged in a revolutionary sequence. And I feel, Raju, I don't know if you agree, that today this remains quite a conundrum, because the petty bourgeoisie could also include the academic, just as it could include the small business owner. Both ideologically would fall into what Lenin calls third, which Lenin prohibits by virtue of his theory of class ideology. Lenin says ultimately in capitalist society, because he's founding his view of capitalism on a notion of necessity, there's two forms of ideology. There's not a third. Whereas petty bourgeoisie today can go off and invent third way ideology, and we can define that as well. But you see my point. I'm saying that because I wonder if A, you agree of the sticky challenge of the category and the presence of petty bourgeoisie, and B, what would you do? What would you say about how we might overcome some of these challenges? I know that's a lot, but please, as you wish.
In 2014 or 2013, for the first time in the history of humanity, the majority of the labor force became the wage workers. Yet, there are classes or class strata between the capitalist and the wage earning or the working class. I was born in India. I spent the first 25 years in that country, so less than half of my life there. And I keep track of what is happening in the global south for some of my research. From the standpoint of the global south, the the peasantry, very important. Massive thousands of farmers are dying in India. They're committing suicide. I don't know if people in North America know. Literally thousands of farmers are committing suicide every single week or day a month. I've written about this elsewhere in the book on India, etc. Anyway, the point is there are people who are neither capitalists nor workers. They're small scale producers, including the peasantry in the global south. But I don't think the petty bourgeois phenomenon is a typical global south issue. I spend a lot of time in the US for various reasons, because that's where my academic and intellectual networks are, and et cetera, et cetera. So in New York City or in Detroit or in Chicago, you see people selling snacks on the street. What are they? And I live in Toronto, and you see in the big malls there are kiosks, watch repairers, etc. What are they? No, small scale businesses, etc. Lenin, of course, is perhaps the Marxist who has spent the most amount of time in the 20th century writing about the peasantry and small-scale production in a way that Marx did not. In fact, that's why one of my books on Capital Volume 1 would ask this question. How would Marx rewrite Capital Volume 1 now if he had met Lenin and Lenin's legacy, and if he had seen the development of capitalism in Russia and China and India, etc.? Anyway, so the point is, the petty bourgeoisie is important. We cannot ignore it. We cannot say capitalism is about capitalists and workers. In fact, that's the point I keep making throughout the book, and also in the state theory book. I look at the state not only from the standpoint of the working class, but also from the standpoint of the small-scale producers, the petty producers, who are often exploited, not necessarily in the labor process, in the workplace, but in the markets for finance, credit, and commodity markets, fertilizers market and seeds market, etc. So the problems of petty small-scale producers, the proletarian party has to recognize. It has to recognize that there are people who own small-scale businesses. Let's say my neighbor who is a plumber. He doesn't own really anything, but he's a small-scale business. I mean, he owns something, but he's a small-scale business person. Lenin was, he emphasized the need for some kind of an alliance between the working class and the small-scale producing people, petty producers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is very important. But people normally think that's important maybe in the global south, and it isn't important in North America. I reject that. No, there is a petty bourgeois class right here in front of us. Look, Lenin made 2 points. The working class, the revolutionaries cannot bring about a revolution by themselves. They have to enter into alliances with non-communists, such as scientists. Number 2, the working class cannot bring about a revolution by itself. There has to be interaction, collaboration, alliance with petty producers, small-scale producers, who are not exploiters, right? Small scale. They are not exploiters like capitalist farmers, etc., etc. But there is a need for, but not just an alliance. You have to understand their problems. For example, when a socialist government comes, there are concrete steps that government will immediately take, which is to provide subsidized loans to small-scale producers. In fact, my own idea may be a little reformist, and I pardon. I would ask that you ignore that maybe a little bit. In fact, one of my ideas is very provisionally, many petty producers could be voluntarily moved out of petty production into collective labor process. If you increase the wages by 5 times, 4 times, 3 times,
Mm.
Many people who are being now forced to
Mm.
enter into small-scale business,
Mm-hmm.
they will perhaps come and work in big factories, big enterprises. Anyway, so the point is there is a need for an alliance, there needs for an understanding of the problems of the petty producers. What else I wanted to say? But you have to be careful. Lenin was a master of class differentiation approach. That's why he was against this idea of populism. People. There's no such thing as a people, or an undifferentiated peasantry.
Mm.
So we have the peasantry is always, howsoever slowly, being differentiated into a variety of classes:
Mm.
capitalist farmers, rich peasants, the family peasants, the poor peasants, meaning half-time laborers and half-time peasants and landless laborers, etc. Same thing in the urban context. The
Mm-hmm.
petty producers are being differentiated, but Lenin advocated the following: Marxists should think about the petty producers not from the standpoint of the capitalist class. They should think about they should encourage the petty producers to think about themselves not as potential capitalists, but as potential wage workers. So that would that would be conducive to some kind of alliance between these two classes.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I still see the fundamental contradiction in the United States around the libertarian desire of the entrepreneurial ideology, which is so deeply entrenched and which is so deeply programmed to be against collective liberation, collective thinking, to even conceive of dialectics as a form of sociality, let alone a form of totality. Both things are thrown out for the kind of vulgar American ideology. And that actually leads me to my next question around this question of standpoint. And you say some interesting things. A lot of academic Marxists are convinced, and Lukács is part of the reason why this has become, I think, quite problematic, of the question of alienation and its relation to class. And you say something quite nice regarding the way that class standpoint, or let's say estrangement, to use this term, might be better here, actually is classed in the sense you say that there is a kind of estrangement that all classes undergo in capitalism, but there is a fundamental difference in the estrangement of a bourgeois experience of estrangement, insofar as actually Marx points out that their estrangement can actually be paradoxically celebrated or relished, or there's no consequences, whereas proletarian estrangement has material consequences, which also involve suffering. Even though we don't want to fetishize that suffering, it's involved. And it's always been interesting to me, looking at a lot of my friends who are grad students, bashing their head against the wall about this question of alienation in Marx. We need a better theory of alienation in Marx. And it's like, maybe if we went back to Marxist class theory, we might not be so confused about the question to begin with. But maybe that's not true. I don't want to kind of shut down, study or anything like that. I think alienation still needs to be studied. But I wonder if you have any comments on that topic.
There is a chapter on class consciousness, at least one chapter. By class consciousness, when people say there isn't much class consciousness, people usually mean the working class isn't conscious of its problems or what it can do. Similarly, when people say, oh, there's not much class struggle, people really mean that no, when the working class, let's say there's no strike today and so on, oh, there's not much class struggle going on. I think these are fundamentally mistaken ideas about class consciousness and class struggle.
And the same thing they say that when the Amazon workers don't vote in their self-interest, it must mean that we can abandon working class consciousness. It's
Yes.
it's a futile.
Yeah. So I think that but if we apply dialectics, this confusion will not work. This confusion will not happen. Remember, everything in the world can be seen from the standpoint of opposed classes. In fact, in the chapter on philosophy, I say towards the end of the chapter, why does philosophy matter in terms of political economy, etc. Okay, so one point that I make there is every process, for example, the interest rate rise in the US now, are not just in the US, by the way. Inflation, rise in interest rate, GDP, income, all these things, they're like as if they're class neutral. They aren't. If you think about these political, economic, or economic categories in a class theory framework, you will see that there are two opposed angles. What does the interest rate rise mean? Is it just the interest rate rise? No. It's a class issue. Because you raise the interest rate, you drive you increase unemployment, you decrease the bargaining, reduce the bargaining power of the working class. Anyway, so the point is, everything has to be seen from opposed class standpoint. So that's one. Then that applies to consciousness and struggle. So what I say in the discussion on class struggle is class struggle happens from the top, let's say the bourgeois class struggle, landlords and the state, and from below, when common people engage in class struggle. Class consciousness. The bourgeoisie has its own class consciousness, by the way. I mean, one is greed, if you think about this as class consciousness. All these ideas about competitiveness, I want to be in control, this sort of arrogance and so on, these are aspects of bourgeois class consciousness. And then there are working class consciousness, aspects of working class consciousness. So why did I go to class consciousness idea? I've now lost the chain of my thinking. I wanted to say I can't remember why I went to class consciousness. You have to remind me.
I was asking you regarding alienation in Marx and regarding estrangement.
Yes.
And what your thoughts are about, there's many questions that Marx has unfinished this. He's unfinished that.
Yes.
More needs to be done here. More needs to be done there. And many of those points are valid. And one of those areas that we hear about a lot is Marx did not properly theorize alienation. And I wanted to ask you if you agree with that, and because most intellectual Marxists today do not speak about class in these terms that we're speaking about it, maybe my hypothesis would be this is part of the reason why they don't, or rather they see Marx's comments on alienation as limited. And obviously Lukács saw them as limited, which is partially why he developed his theory of reification. So I just wanted to invite you to speak about that. Yeah.
Marx spent some time on alienation during his sort of earlier times. But once he turned to political economy in 1860s, he wrote less and less on alienation. So Bertel Ollman once said to me, Raju, can you think about class theory from the standpoint of alienation? By the way, I should say this anecdote to you. So he was here in Toronto. I gave him a copy of the book, and he took the book, and he was in the flight with his wife to New York City. Then he sent me a message after returning to New York City. He said, Raju, my wife was sitting just next to me. I could not put away the book. This is a all you want to know about class theory book. So I couldn't put it away. I said, that is very, very, very kind. But anyway, Bertel said that alienation and class theory, they are closely connected. And I thought about that. It's actually true. We have not quite actually talked so far about what I think class theory should be about, but very briefly, the way I think about capitalism, for example, in one sentence, capitalism is a relations along three lines: relations of private property, relations around exchange, relations around value and surplus value. Remember, the relations are very important in dialectics. Now, think about this. Think about the connection between these three things and alienation, and contradiction, and dialectics in general. So, what about private property? Some people have access to private property and other people don't. But this did not fall from the sky. The fact that the vast majority of the people of the world are alienated from the means of production is not a naturally given thing. This alienation has been happening over the last 400, 500 years. Point number one. Point number two, capitalism is a relation of exchange. What does it mean? Everything is bought and sold. Education, healthcare, everything, food and shelter, etc. Well, you can say you are free to buy the house that you want to buy, the cup that you want to buy. Have you noticed if you go to I just returned from Illinois. We went to the some of the stores. How many types of toothpaste on the shelves? Does anyone even have the time to compare? But anyway, so you have a lot of choice. So there is a lot of choice in capitalism. You are free to buy this toothpaste or that toothpaste or this kind of shirt or that kind of shirt, etc. Fair enough. Okay. I mean, who doesn't like freedom? But look at the alienation. Sometimes when it's too hot, I go to walk with my wife in the mall, in the nearby mall, because there's air conditioning. And in the middle of the sort of main hall, I saw on the ATM machine there was a little advertisement. It said something like this: "It feels good to use your own money," it said. Well, of course, I have to have money for me to feel good about using my money. I have to have the money to buy whatever toothpaste or house that I want to buy. So let me be more precise with respect to alienation and exchange relations. Yes, everything is a commodity. The working class, its ability to work is also a commodity. The working class is free to work for, or a given worker is free to work for X today and Y tomorrow. Good. In fact, capitalism is actually a better society. I will defend capitalism relative to pre-capitalism. I'm serious. So there is that sort of freedom. But here the alienation. The quantity of exchange value is important. You have to have a significant amount of exchange value for you to have access to the things that are being exchanged. But you are alienated from an adequate amount of exchange value because you don't own the means of production. An unequal distribution of means of production ultimately controls unequal distribution of money, consumption items, etc. So I think of capitalism in terms of exchange value or exchange relations, and that specifically means there are some people who have an adequate amount of exchange value to be able to meet their needs, and other people don't. And the vast majority of the working class is alienated from that situation. Number three, value and surplus value. We produce toys or cups, or we work in call centers, we produce a certain amount of value. Or let's say net value, net of depreciation, cost of production, etc. But a large part of the value that we produce, we are alienated from. Again, alienation. And therefore, we produce surplus value, and the surplus value, and that surplus value, in fact, a lot more than surplus value, The average surplus value is taken out of us. That's why I spend some time on what I call super exploitation, that is above average rate of exploitation. And that happens when you and I, we go and work, but we do not get a wage that corresponds to Marx's, what Marx called the value of labor power, meaning the cost of maintenance. Marx actually assumed that everyone, an average worker, is paid at value, meaning the wage is equal to the cost of maintenance. But in fact, if you think about this, Marx actually assumes a very nice form of capitalism, a capitalism where people are paid a wage which covers the cost of maintenance. So therefore, in terms of value and surplus value, we are alienated from value and surplus value. And then, of course, we are alienated from the entire process of production. Who decides what is to be produced, how, where, etc. Analytical Marxism says to understand class, we don't need to understand labor process and production. Vivek Chibber keeps saying that from DSA, etc. I think that is fundamentally mistaken. If you do not understand production, you will not understand most of what happens in political economy, and therefore you won't understand class theory. And this one final comment that I make in the philosophy chapter is between political economy and class theory. I want to emphasize this. The two are connected. Any discussion on class which does not give attention to political economy is mere sociologism. It's just a bunch of relations, etc. But any discussion on political economy that does not look at political economic categories from the standpoint of opposed classes is also inadequate. So I wanted to bring the two strands of Marxist thinking together, class theory and political economy.
Yeah. Unfortunately, most people doing political economy today do not focus on class theory at all.
Yes, exactly.
That's tragic. And we look forward to your review, your book on Capital Volume 1. Two things I want to close with. The first is you mentioned something that interests me a lot lately, which is that you say in the project of the class struggle for the abolition of all classes, there needs to be a thinking. This is an idea that you get also from Lenin. I was just reading this today towards the end of your book, this morning when I was finishing it, of a different form of equality than we have in bourgeois society. And this is a tricky question because on the one hand, we are aware of Marx's debates with many interlocutors regarding egalitarianism and the inadequacy of egalitarianism. We are aware of that. But both Marx as well as Lenin say something along the lines that you do need something like a proletarian politics, which would infuse a different form of equality into the class struggle. That interests me quite a lot as someone who's interested in political philosophy, because in my view, one of the dynamics of the neoliberal era that we live in is that we are suffocated by bad theories of equality. And this has really brainwashed so many of us into not being able to think what Lenin called actual equality, right? It becomes a kind of violent utopian gesture to think equality as communism. And that bothers me because if we are stuck that way, then how can we ever inculcate a sense of an alternative form of life, alternative form of sociality, social relation that would be beyond the commodity form, yeah? To do that requires some thinking on equality on behalf of the working class, on behalf of the proletariat, in my opinion. Do you agree, and what would you say?
Tell me exactly what you want me to agree or disagree on.
About Lenin's insistence of a different form of equality, which is not exactly bourgeois egalitarianism in the political struggle. You mention it. I can give you the page that you mentioned it. Well, it's in the, I think, second to last chapter.
Right.
what would that look like today? And that's my interest. That's my question.
Different kind of equality or inequality in socialism. Because remember, both are relevant there. So that's why I'm slightly curious myself. Because there will be equality and there will be inequality. Because remember, Lenin split up the idea of communism, partly following Marx, into two forms, a lower form and a higher form. So that's why I'm just slightly curious now that you mentioned this.
Mm-hmm.
So there is equality and there is inequality within socialism. So which one are you thinking of, equality or inequality?
I'm thinking of the equality that would birth itself in the society wherein the rule of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs would be a different form of equality than the one we currently have.
Right.
That's what's interesting to me.
Right. Okay.
And this might take us back to something like dictatorship of proletariat, also even to maybe, why not, the question of vanguard, which you defend. And I think you helpfully clarify that when Lenin talks about the vanguard, he's talking about a dialectical process of a kind of, he's not talking about some special elect of some elites
Yes.
who, like Stalin, they remain the master theoreticians unchallenged. Although I will say, Raju, it would be helpful for a book to be written, and maybe there are books written on this, to clarify and to defend Lenin's notion of vanguard, because that is another one that people say was hijacked by Stalin, was perverted, and is very hierarchical, and there's many problems with it.
Yes.
But the way that you approach it is quite different. So my question there is sort of revolving around also because one of the things that interests me is socialism as a philosophical project for not only educating people about reading important Marxist works of theory, that's important, but also why do we not speak of the category of the organic intellectual anymore? Why do we abandon these kinds of avenues by which Marxist theory can be rethought in contradistinction from, I don't know, mainstream bourgeois philosophy? That interests me as well as a philosophical approach. That's why I'm interested in a question of equality. And the other reason I'm interested in equality is because I'm writing a book on left-wing Nietzscheanism.
Mm-hmm.
And Nietzsche, as a philosopher, as you probably know, argued that 19th century proletarian politics represented what he called ressentiment, right? And a deep species being level that infected the working classes and disabled them from being able to adequately or rationally know anything about their own liberation, right? Which is why Nietzsche is actually a great antagonist to the Marxist struggle. And why Nietzsche actually complicates equality from Marx's point of view, in my opinion, because ultimately Nietzsche convinces bourgeoisie that there is no such thing as equality. And so we can kind of forfeit that, which of course Marx would agree on that in principle within a bourgeois society. But my question would be, don't we need to actually reinterrogate and rethink equality? That's my question, but I know you probably have many thoughts.
Okay. A couple of things which may not be connected to one another, because you're raising very important points and questions. In terms of equality and inequality, let me just say this. A class society is not to be seen as an unequal society. So, okay, let me say this again in a different way. It is technically wrong to say that a class society is an unequal society. Now, this might sound counterintuitive, but think about this. If a class society is seen as an unequal society, the opposite of that will be an equal society. Or no. If a class society is seen as an unequal society, then you would have things like reduction in inequality. David Harvey talked about restoration of class, etc. In fact, David Harvey talks about restoration of class relations under neoliberalism. Just imagine this. What's that supposed to mean? With welfare state, there was no class because there was a little more equality. And now with neoliberalism, with more inequality, class is restored. No. To think of class society in terms of inequality in income and consumption items is very problematic.
Yes, I agree. But let me say something very quickly.
Yeah.
I see the logic. It's a dialectical point, which is if your educational model is insisting on a new form of thinking equality, you're going to get caught within the kind of matrices of a false dualism, of a redistributive welfarist approach. Of course. However, that does not solve the possibility that a form of equality must also be thought, which would also accept and transcend and move beyond that limited bourgeois form. So that I think was what Lenin meant when he said that the advancement of the struggle will necessitate, and to me it's a question of the revolutionary imagination.
Yeah. Okay.
Let me ask you another way.
Yeah.
Why would the working class possess the desire for the abolition of all classes? That is the central issue. And in my view, there are a number of ways you can interrogate into the contradictions of bourgeois society which we live in that would show and reveal its impasses. And one of its impasses is actually on equality. It cannot live up to its demand. It's an ideological problem which it cannot solve. Therefore, there must be another form of equality that can be thought beyond it. That's not easy to do. This is a very tricky problem, because I see the danger. You can fall back into what Eric Olin Wright fell back into, which is basically egalitarian socialism. And I think we both agree that's inadequate. So okay.
Class society is not merely an unequal society, because to say that, then the next step is, if you say that, the next step is there can be more equality. There can be equality. So Lenin asked this question: what does equality between landlords and peasantry mean? Can there be more equality between landlords and peasants, between capitalists and workers? This is the question he asks. So one has to be very careful that one should not think of class society merely in terms of equality versus inequality. I'm not saying that that issue isn't important, but there is something else. Okay, that takes me to epistemology, by the way. A fundamental epistemological idea, in fact, in all of my books, is we have to start with relationships or structures of relations. Structures of relations give rise to mechanisms. Let's say capital labor relation, etc., giving rise to competition, exploitation, etc. Structure of relations leading to mechanisms. Mechanisms lead to actual concrete effects or outcomes. Then the outcomes are experienced by people subjectively, etc., etc. So our analysis of society must be at multiple levels. Structures of relations which may not be always observable or easily. Then mechanisms, competition, exploitation, etc. Then poverty, inequality, etc., etc. Then people's experience. So class society is not it's just about equality, inequality in terms of income, consumption, etc. That's one. Number two, when you overthrow capitalism, bring about what Lenin calls socialism or the lower form of communism. He says, like Marx, he says, there will be equality, there will be inequality. Because, look, this is of course there is a difference between Marxism and anarchism. I'm sure there is common ground, and many anarchists, they also want to see a communist society and so on, but there are fundamental differences. And one, of course, one difference is whether there should be a state in the socialist society. For Lenin and for me, yes, I will defend the state. I mean, how will you deal with the overthrown classes? Do you think they will just sit quietly and just worship you and be, listen to you? No. Anyway, so you need the state. But the other thing is there will be this stamp of capitalism on socialism. So some people, partly because of natural differences, and Marx talks about the natural differences, by the way. Somebody from Beijing recently critiqued me for ignoring this, but no, there are natural differences. There will be natural differences for a long time period, perhaps. And so some people will make more money than other people, but some people will make more money because they will work harder and longer than other people. You're not going to get rid of all those things immediately. So socialism, to the extent that there will be inequality, some of that inequality will be because it has just come out of capitalism. Yeah, you're not going to get rid of it immediately. What will be gotten rid of is somebody who is wanting to work, who is able to work and not working now. That will not happen. The sort of completely wasteful expenditure of time and money and resources in the useless, predatory, imperialist wars that America has been engaged in, and not just America, that will not happen. So people will be fully employed. The wages, when was the last time the nominal wage was increased, or there was an increase in real wage in America, for example? So there will be a decent wage, there will be employment for all, there will be shelter, etc. So in other words, the subsistence needs will be met of the common people. To the extent that the capitalist class will have lost control over the property and the big landlords, then there will be also much less equality. In fact, there will be no individual, or there will not be large-scale ownership of productive resources. So in other words, inequality will really come down. You are not going to get rid of the private property of small-scale producers we talked about. In fact, the socialist society will make available subsidized credit, etc., to the peasantry. But Lenin's point was that, against Stalin, by the way, no forced collectivization. Socialism should not be forcibly imposed on these small-scale producers. And Lenin's theory was education. And when the small-scale producers will see the advantages of big or factories and enterprises managed by workers or by the state initially, etc., then many of the small-scale producers will voluntarily join or work in those enterprises. Anyway, so the point is there will be some inequality. There will be a lot more equality than in capitalism. But I want to make one more point, and here is my sort of criticism of Lenin and in favor of Trotsky on this point, because this has huge implication for the theory of the state that I talk about in the next book, which is Lenin actually underemphasized the connection between the state and inequality in income and consumption. That's a huge issue. So the state has the sort of power over us. By the way, for me, the state is part of class theory. The state theory is a part of class theory. The state has to be seen as a part of class relationship. Again, I know some of my friends in New York, they disagree, but that's beside the point. So for For Lenin, if the state is as coercive as it is because it wants to defend, it has to defend private property relations. Trotsky's point was, yes, but more needs to be said. For example, in Stalinist Russia, he did not have really capitalist private property, but there was an authoritarian state. Lenin underemphasized this aspect of inequality in his thinking about the state, and Trotsky is the person that I go to supplement Lenin. But that's a huge issue, Daniel, and that because that goes into state theory and all kinds of things. I want to say a couple of other things. Yes, you talked about, there is much inequality, and the working class must make a demand for reduction in inequality to the extent possible. Inequality in consumption items, inequality in income, etc. But the Marxists have no business in suggesting government policy about how to manage capitalism. Everything that the working class needs, the working class must demand. And for me, these demands must be transitional demands, not minimal demands, not a little increase in wages, but a demand such as the demand for employment for all with an inflation-adjusted living wage. Every time the prices rise by 5%, wages must rise by 5% at least, and everyone must have the opportunity to be employed. That is a demand. Look, a lot of inequality happens because, let's say, within the working class, some people are employed and others aren't. Some people are employed for 40 hours and other people cannot find job where they can work for even 10 hours. There are 0 hours thing happening and so on. So this sort of inequality must be reduced, and there has to be a transitional demand by the masses. Then another transitional demand. Look, there's a lot of housing inequality. Some people have a lot more, let's say, space than other people. In fact, do you know what happened in 1917 Russia? Wealthy people's houses were shared by the working class people when the new government came. What I'm saying is the working class must demand housing for all, period. They must demand transit for all, period. Do you know how many people in America cannot go to work because they don't have access to transportation? Why should that happen? So what I'm saying is inequality is a big issue, especially after 1970 under neoliberal capitalism. But reduction in inequality should not be a public policy measure. Reduction in inequality is a matter of transitional demand. A transitional demand is a transitional demand that connects the current situation in terms of people's consciousness to the socialist project, to the project of conquering state power. And so therefore, reduction in inequality must be a massive transitional demand by the working class.
Yeah, that's really great. I fully see that. I think the transitional demand and the Trotskyist emphasis is significant there. And I guess my question would be that most of my family from working class tend to think that the inequality we have today is a kind of natural one, right? They look at it as naturalized, right?
Yes.
So it's a very tricky dynamic when we speak about equality, in the sense that it is a category of consciousness which is Marxists are not permitted to necessarily enhance or promote for the reasons you said. But at the same time, my wager is, in the current conjecture, maybe actually something does need to be done here. Otherwise, how can we think of an ideological class struggle that would actually bring us to the point where we're able to center, let's say, ambitious transitional demands? Because it's also a matter of the class struggle reaching a point of maturity so that we can get to that stage. And that's really, frankly, a whole other conversation we should have. I want to end our. We've gone for 2 hours. This has been incredible, and your enthusiasm for this topic is unmatched, my friend. Can you say a little bit more about the other research projects you're currently engaged in? For example, you've done 2 books now on state theory, I think, and you have the one on political economy, and you also have the one on the working class. That's quite a lot. You're quite prolific, Raju, I must say. And I see that the source of your inspiration here, I see that you have a profound inspiration for this material, which is really, really refreshing to see that. Do you want to tell us a bit more about your current research and writing?
Yes. Everything revolves around, of course, class and state and political economy, with a heavy dose of materialist dialectics as a philosophy, and with a strong intent to see revolutionary change in the world, and where possible, be a part of it. But that's a separate story. In terms of intellectual work, my first book actually was on the notion of critique. I took Marx's idea very seriously. He said, I know what we need to do, a ruthless criticism of everything that is existing. But ever since I returned to grad school at Ohio State, I heard the word critique, critical this, critical that. So I want to write a book on critique. So that was the beginning. Then a book on class.
So in other words, the critique in academia was not so ruthless.
Yes, exactly. In both senses. And one of the 2 meanings that Marx gave to his notion of critique is, I'm not fearful of the powers that be. So anyway, so critique, and then that actually helped me think about sort of class theory things. So class theory, then class theory led to state theory. State theory book is a part of the series of 4 books on Capital Volume 1. Remember, the state theory book is actually about Capital Volume 1. People think Capital Volume 1 is about economics. It is about economics, but it's not entirely about economics. Well, that is the dialectical Marx. It is about class struggle. Remember, one of the finest lines about class struggle that I have learned from Marx is from Capital Volume 1. Marx says, it is not enough for resources to be controlled by the capitalist class for capitalism to exist. Capitalism also requires a working class which, by virtue of education and habit, accepts capitalism as natural. Those on the left who entirely dismiss academic work, they always say, if I write a book on Marxist class theory, it's an academic book. Some people on the left say, what do you mean by academic book? So some people on the left, they have a little sort of hypercritical view of academic work. I mean, there is a reason most of what comes out of academia is pure rubbish, really. Anyway, so the point is, academia is a small site of ideological class struggle. So we make use of it. Anyway, what I was going to say? Yeah, the state theory book is a part of the series of 4. 2 on the state. One is the politics and ideology of the state, and one is the state and coercive dispossession around Marx theory of dispossession, a critique of Marx theory in the hands of Harvey, then a discussion of Harvey, then a critique of Harvey, then return to Marx to reconstruct the theory of dispossession for the 21st century. So these are the 2 books. Then finally, the 4th volume is on Capital Volume 1 in terms of its economics or political economy. So the question that I'm asking there is, if Karl Marx was alive, if he met, let's say, Lenin, and if he confronted or encountered the Lenin legacy, and if he saw development of capitalism in the rural and urban areas in the global south, how would he rewrite Capital Volume 1? So that's the project. So that will be a sort of huge book on in terms of pages. I don't know about huge in terms of content. So that's number 4. Then the next one is a book on Marxist, the nature of Marxist theory. For me, it is not enough to say that Marxism counts, that Marxism matters. For me, Marxism does not only matter, Marxism is the most important set of ideas that matters. So in other words, I'm not satisfied with saying that Marxism is distinctive, unique, etc. And analytical Marxism has even given up on that. There's nothing much distinctive about Marxism. For postmodernist Marxism, Marxist ideas, there's one of many different ideas. So, but I want to defend not only Marxism as different, but also, and more importantly, the superiority of Marxism. So that's another book. Then a book on, there's a little bit of work that I do on the empirical front about India. And this is about a book on the class character of the pre-neoliberal Indian state, which has and been creating the conditions for the emergence of far right that we see now. So some of my work has been on the far right in the US and in India. So I have a book now. I'm signing the contract in a couple of weeks from now. It's called The Antinomies of the Post-Truth Capitalism, Lying and Loving. So there's a discussion on Marxist theory of love, and then Marxist theory of lying, political lying, and what's the connection between the two.
Where does Marx write on lying, out of curiosity? He
talked. There's not a whole lot, but I went to some other people, Trotsky, etc. Why lying is so essential to capitalism. For Marx, the idea was sort of more general, that the ruling class controls people's ideas, etc., etc. But anyway, so lying is a very important thing. But I'm not talking about normal, the small scale lying. I'm talking about things like this. Trump goes to a rally, maybe there are 500 people, he comes back and he says, this is the largest rally that any politician has had, or some such thing. I'm just making it up,
right.
But something similar. That sort of massive political lying. Or the lying that, in ancient India, they used to fly aeroplanes. What nonsense. So because these ideas are fueling fascistic tendencies, but these post-truth ideas are connected to academia, postmodernism. I'm connecting the political ideological lying to postmodernism, to fascism, and then explaining these connections in terms of capitalism and imperialism.
Yes. And I want to ask you one final thing, since I have you, and since you mentioned David Harvey, I'm curious what you think of the value for Marxist tendency, especially Mikhail Heinrich's work. Do you find that much of it is exegetical, but much of it's very interpretive, of course, too? Do you find that mode of analysis to be good and useful?
I will have more to say when I finish my book on Capital One, so that will be another conversation.
Okay, let's do that. I've taken a lot of your time, my friend.
No, that's fine. It's a pleasure to speak to you. And
this was a true pleasure and honor of mine.
One small thing, you mentioned Stalinism 10 minutes ago, and I just want to say that since 1924, Stalinism has gone its own way, and it has departed from Marxism, or genuine Marxism that Marx and Engels and Lenin established, and then Trotsky and Luxemburg, etc., defended and developed. So many people conflate Marxism with Stalinism. For me, Marxism is to be distinguished not only from conservative ideas, not only from liberalism, not only from social democracy, not only from far right, not only from identity politics and postmodernism, etc., but also fundamentally from Stalinism. And I hope, in fact, in every book I make it very clear, Stalinism must not be confused with Marxism. Marxism is nothing if it is not the highest level of humanity's consciousness. And Marxism is nothing if it is not without. Marxism is a body of ideas that imagines society as democratic at multiple social and geographical scales. That's what I mean. If you think about the future society, a society where there is solidarity among people, there is harmony between humanity and nature, there is harmony across countries, nations, etc. So it's a fundamentally beautiful idea. I said this about Marxism to my semi-literate mother back in India 20 years ago, when she's very religious. She's from rural India. She actually understood this. She said, I did not know this is what you were thinking of. So that's why I'm very keen to write this, finish this book on love, because I want to connect the idea of love, the inadequacy of bourgeois notion of love, instead of love is about me and my wife or husband and my children, etc., etc., in abstraction from wider society. And so what's the potential connection between the Marxist concept of love and the proletarian struggle, for example?
Yeah.
So anyway,
No, I completely agree with you, in part because the two traditions we started off critiquing, anti-essentialist and analytical Marxism, because they reject the ontological antagonism that capitalism produces vis-a-vis classes, they probably also, maybe you could say, don't have an adequate theory of how love would be tied to those antagonisms in interesting ways. And I've always felt that myself in doing political work or even doing theoretical work with comrades. It's a different kind of Marxist, antagonistic form of love that can appear in those exchanges and so on. Love that is not merely love of the idea in some abstract idealist contemplative sense, also because it's connected to material struggle.
Think about this. If you're in India, you are a Muslim man. If you fall in love with a Hindu woman, your love is called love war. That means you want to convert Hindus and you want to increase Muslim population. Love has been turned into hatred. Now, but then this is not a psychological situation. There are fundamental objective reasons for transformation of normal love to hatred. That is one example. From another angle, Lenin talks about class hatred. So, in other words, a part of working class consciousness must be class hatred towards the capitalist class. But what's the opposite of hatred? Love. But then where love? I'm not going to love the capitalist class, but then that doesn't mean love isn't important. Love is among the workers, and love therefore fuels potentially, in a very small way, however small way, some kind of working class solidarity. So that's where, so solidarity, it's a relation of love, comradely love type. I'm not saying romantic love isn't important within socialist movement, etc. But there is more to love than
it's like equality in a sense. It's a very difficult category to transcend, and requires very sophisticated thinking of dialectics. Okay, we will close. Thanks everyone for watching. Raju, thank you very much for your passionate and brilliant responses in tonight's conversation. I was really honored to chat with you, and it was a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Daniel. Thank you, Daniel.
We will be in touch.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, everybody.